Today I'm going to bring you the original version of some very famous fairy tales, which are much darker and usually don't have the happy ending that Disney shows us. About the Snow White tale, from what I've seen, no one knows exactly what the origin of the story is. It seems that the structure of the story, or something similar to the structure of Snow White, first appeared in the Pentamerone, where Basile, who was the author of this book, was an aristocrat and Italian poet who had immense respect for the stories of his homeland. And his story, called The Young Slave, or Young Slave as I've seen in English, shows many of the literary tropes that have since become the standard in stories like Snow White. Anyway, the story was published by the famous German brothers Jacob and Will Hingry. I'm not sure, but most likely they must have changed the story, since many of them were collected and put together for their children's book. The original story is called Schneewitching, which is in German, right? Which basically translates to Snow White as well. They tell it as follows. Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen was sitting and sewing by a window, and the window frame was made of black ebony. And as she was sewing and looking out the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with a needle, and 3 drops of blood fell onto the snow. And the red looked very beautiful on that white snow. And she thought to herself, what if I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the window frame? Soon after, she had a little daughter who was as white as snow and as red as blood, and her hair was ebony black. And so she was called Little Snow White, or Snow White. And when the child was born, her mother died. After a year, the king took another wife for himself. She was a very beautiful woman, but very proud and arrogant, and she could not stand anyone surpassing her in beauty. She had a wonderful mirror, and when she stood in front of it, she looked at herself and repeated to it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the mirror answered, "You, O queen, are the most beautiful and fairest of all." Then she was very pleased, for she knew that the mirror spoke the truth. But Snow White grew up and became more and more beautiful. When she was 7 years old, she was as lovely as the day, and more beautiful than the queen herself. And once, when the queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest and most beautiful of all?" then it answered, "O queen, you are the most beautiful of all who are here, but the most beautiful one would still be Snow White." Then the queen was shocked and turned yellow and green with envy. From that moment on, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart pounded in her chest. She hated this girl so much. Her envy and pride grew more and more in her heart, like a weed, so that she had no peace, neither day nor night. She then called a hunter and said, "Take this child to the forest. I don't want to see her anymore. Kill her and bring me her lungs and liver as proof that you have completed your task." The hunter then obeyed and took the child to the nearby forest. But when he drew his knife and was ready to pierce the heart of the innocent Branca de Neve, she began to cry and said that she would disappear and he would never see her again if he let her escape. And the hunter accepted the proposal. After wandering through the forest for hours, Branca de Neve discovers a small cabin belonging to a group of 7 dwarfs, who interestingly do not have names in this version. Well, since there was no one at home, she went inside, made herself some food, drank a little water or wine, and then tried out all the beds. Upon reaching the last bed, she found it comfortable, laid down, and fell asleep. When the dwarfs returned home, they realized someone else was inside, so they thought it must be a thief. They then started running all over the house frantically. And when they went upstairs, they found Branca de Neve there, asleep. After waking up, she explains that her stepmother attempted to murder her. The dwarfs then feel sorry for her and let her stay with them in exchange for a job as a housemaid. And they told her to be very careful and not let anyone into the house while they were away working in the mountains. And Snow White kept growing and becoming more and more beautiful. Meanwhile, the queen, who believed she had gotten rid of her, finally decided to ask the mirror again. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is now the fairest of them all?" The mirror then says it would be Snow White. And it says that besides being very beautiful, she is now hiding in the dwarf's house. The queen then becomes very furious and decides to kill Snow White herself. First, she shows up at the dwarf's house disguised as an old peddler and offers Snow White a colorful silky carpet as a gift. The queen ties her up so tightly that Snow White faints, but the dwarfs return just in time to save Snow White by loosening all the ties. Next, the queen dresses up as a comb seller and convinces Snow White to take a gift home. She combs Snow White's hair with a poisoned comb. The girl is poisoned by the comb, but revived by the dwarfs when they remove it from her hair. But then, finally one day, the queen disguises herself as a farmer's wife and offers Snow White a poisoned apple. At first, Snow White refuses, but then the queen cuts the apple in half and eats the clean, non-poisoned half in front of Snow White to show that everything is fine. Then Snow White takes a bite of the other half of the apple and falls into a coma, making the queen think she had finally won. This time, the dwarfs can't revive her and think that the queen has finally managed to kill her. They placed her in a glass coffin for a funeral and left it in the forest, which was strange, but it would get even weirder. The next day, a prince comes across Snow White, apparently dead there in the middle of the forest, lying in her glass coffin during a trip he was taking. Well, after hearing her story told by the 7 dwarfs, the prince is given permission to take Snow White to her resting place in his father's castle. Suddenly, while Snow White was being transported, one of the prince's servants stumbles and loses his balance. This causes a piece of poisoned apple to come out of Snow White's throat, which ends up reviving her. Well, but there's another version that's a bit more bizarre. It says, at least in the 1812 version, that the prince became so obsessed, so in love with the, quote, dead Snow White there, that he carried her coffin everywhere. Eventually, a furious servant removes Snow White from the coffin and strikes her back, dislodging a piece of apple from her throat. Well, anyway, the prince is very happy with this miracle and declares his love for the now alive Snow White. She ends up being very surprised to meet him face to face, right? Because basically until now she was dead. Well, anyway, she accepts the marriage proposal and the prince invites all the parents to the wedding except for Snow White's stepmother. Well, the queen, believing she had finally gotten rid of Snow White, asks her magic mirror once again who is the fairest in the land. The mirror says that it is a prince's bride, who is even more beautiful than the queen herself. Well, she then decides to attend this wedding to see what was happening and to investigate who this bride was. Well, upon arriving, the queen is frozen with anger and fear when she discovers that the prince's bride is her stepdaughter, Snow White herself. The furious queen tries to sow chaos and attempts to kill her again, but the prince notices the threat to Snow White, and when he learns the truth from his bride, as punishment for the attempted murder of Snow White, the prince orders the queen to wear a pair of red-hot iron shoes and dance in them until she falls dead. With the queen finally defeated and dead, Snow White's wedding with the prince continues peacefully. Well, The Little Mermaid was written by Hans Christian Andersen, and out of curiosity, he also wrote the story, The Ugly Duckling, which is also quite famous. Well, The Little Mermaid was originally published in 1837 as part of a collection of fairy tales for children. And it goes like this. The Little Mermaid, who doesn't have a name because she's the youngest of the princesses, is described in the text as the most graceful, the most beautiful among her sisters. She lives in an underwater kingdom with her father, who is the king of the wizards. She also has her grandmother and her 5 older sisters, each one a year apart in age. When one of these mermaids turns 15, she is allowed to swim up to the surface. And as the sisters grow up, each of them visits the surface in a different year. When one of them returns and tells her sisters about her adventures, the Little Mermaid's curiosity about the human world grows even more. When it's the Little Mermaid's turn, she sees a prince on a ship while exploring the surface and falls in love. A storm appears, and the Little Mermaid saves the prince from drowning and unconsciously takes him to the shore near a temple, and waits until a young woman from the temple finds him. The prince fails to notice the Little Mermaid. She asks her grandmother about the differences between humans and the beings in her kingdom. So she explains that humans have much shorter lives, but when a mermaid dies, she turns into sea foam and eventually disappears, while humans have an eternal soul that even after death continues to live in heaven. The little mermaid then wishes for an eternal soul and the prince's love, so she goes to the sea witch, who offers her an option. In exchange for her voice, the witch would give her a potion that would give her human legs, and with that, she could live on the earthly plane, or rather, she could live on land. The sea witch warns her that once she becomes human, she can never return to the ocean, and that by drinking the potion, she will feel as if 1,000 swords are piercing her body. But when she recovers, she will have a pair of legs capable of dancing like no other human. However, she would always feel as if several swords were stabbing her feet. Besides, she would only get a soul if she found the kiss of her true love. And if the prince loved her too and married her, if that didn't happen, on the first dawn after the prince married another woman, the little mermaid would die with a broken heart and dissolve into foam. The little mermaid drinks the potion and meets the prince, who feels very attracted to her because of her beauty and grace, even though she is mute. And knowing that the prince loves to see her dance, she does it, even though she feels immense pain from it. When the prince's father asks him to marry the neighboring king's daughter, the prince tells the little mermaid that he would not marry that daughter because in fact he was in love with a young woman from the temple, believing that she was the one who saved him. And the worst part is that this young woman from the temple is actually the neighboring king's daughter, who was actually sent to the temple to be educated. And upon discovering that the two were the same person, the prince accepts the marriage, and it is announced. The two get married. The little mermaid is heartbroken and desperate. She gives up on everything, believing that only death awaits her. But before dawn, her sisters appear with the silver knife that the sea witch gave them in exchange for their long hair. If the little mermaid attacked the prince with this knife and let his blood drip onto her feet, she would become a mermaid again, and her suffering would end. The little mermaid lacks the courage to kill the sleeping prince beside his wife. At dawn, she throws herself into the sea. Her body turns into foam, but instead of disappearing, she ends up becoming a kind of fairy, a daughter of the air. The other spirits tell her that she became a kind of fairy because of her effort to have an eternal life. James Osher de Hallowell Phillips was the writer who first published this story. Originally, it happens like this. Once upon a time, there was an old pig who had 3 children, but she couldn't feed them. So when they were old enough, she sent them out to seek their fortune. The first one was very lazy. He didn't want to work and built his house out of straw. The second one worked a little more, but he was also very lazy, and he built a house out of sticks. They then sang, danced, and played together the rest of the day. The third little pig worked hard all day and built a sturdy brick house with a beautiful fireplace and chimney. It seemed sturdy enough to resist the fiercest gales. The following day, a wolf came by the 3 little pigs' neighborhood. He saw the straw house and smelled a pig inside. He thought the pig would make a fine meal, which would be excellent, and his mouth started to water. So he knocked on the door and said, little pig, let me in, let me in." But the little pig saw the wolf's big paws through the keyhole and refused to let him in. Then the wolf showed his teeth and said, "Then I'll huff and I'll puff and your house will blow down." He huffed and puffed repeatedly until he blew the house down. The wolf opened his mouth wide and bit with all the strength he could, but the first little pig escaped and ran to hide with the second little pig. The wolf kept going through the area and came to the second house made of sticks. He saw the house and smelled a pig inside, and his mouth started to water at the thought of the excellent dinner he would have. He shouted again for the little pig to let him in, but of course they didn't let him. Then the wolf said he would huff and blow down the house of sticks. He really did it. The wolf was greedy and tried to catch both pigs at once, but he was so greedy that he couldn't catch either of them, and the 2 managed to escape to the house of the third little pig. When the wolf reached the house, the 3 were terrified, knowing it wanted to eat them. He hadn't eaten for days, and he would wait as long as it took to devour those 3 who were inside. So the wolf knocked on the door and told them to let him in. Of course, they didn't let him in again. Then the wolf showed his teeth and said he wanted to huff and puff and blow their house down. Well, this time he huffed, and huffed, but nothing happened. In the end, he was so out of breath that he couldn't huff or even speak properly. So he stopped, rested, and thought for a while. The wolf danced with rage and swore he would come down the chimney and eat all the little pigs inside. But while he climbed up to the roof, the pig, who was the third one, the owner of the house there, lit a fire. He put a big pot full of boiling water. And the moment the wolf came down the chimney, the pig took off the lid, the wolf fell inside and died in the scalding water. Well, it turns out the little pigs would have dinner that night, and it would be Lou himself. Cinderella has various versions globally, with the likely oldest originating from China. However, the story we know is based on the tale of Gata Borralera. It became very well known because of the brothers Grimm, and they tell it as follows. Once upon a time, there was a rich man whose wife was ill, and when she felt her end was near, she called her only daughter to her bedside and said, "Dear child, be pious and good, and God will always take care of you. You and I will look after you from heaven, and I will be with you." And she closed her eyes and passed away. The maiden went to her mother's grave every day and wept, and she was always kind and good. When winter came, the snow covered the grave with a white blanket, and when the sun appeared at the beginning of spring and melted it, the man took another wife. The new wife brought 2 daughters home, and they were beautiful, but inside they were very ugly. Then bad times began for the poor stepdaughter. "That stupid creature is going to sit in the same room as us," they said. "Those who eat food must deserve it, because why would we give it to a kitchen maid?" They also took away her beautiful dresses and dressed her in a gray tunic and gave her wooden shoes to wear. They constantly laughed at her actions and told her to remain in the kitchen. She was forced to do the hard work morning, noon, and night, essentially at all hours. She rose early to fetch water, light the fire, cook, and wash, while her sisters did all they could to torment her. They mocked her, scattered peas and lentils in the ashes, and ordered her to pick them up. And at night, when she was very tired from a whole day of work, she had no bed to lie on. She had to rest by the fireplace entirely in the ashes, and since she always looked dusty and dirty, they gave her the name Cinderella. One day, her father went to a fair and asked his 2 stepdaughters what he should bring them. They said they wanted clothes, pearls, jewels, and everything else you can imagine. Then he asked, "But what about you, Cinderella? What do you want?" And Cinderella replied, "The first branch, father. The first branch that brushes against your hat on your way home, that's what I would like." So he went there and bought fine clothes, jewels, and pearls for his stepdaughters. On the way back, as he was riding along a green road, a hazel branch brushed against his hat, and he stopped his horse, picked it up, and took it home. When he returned home, he gave the clothes to his stepdaughters and the hazel branch to Cinderella. She thanked him and ran to her mother's grave. She planted the branch there and cried bitterly because she missed her. Her tears fell and watered the branch. And from it, a beautiful tree blossomed and grew. Whenever Cinderella saw it, she would always cry and pray. And every time a white bird landed on the tree, she would make a wish. And the bird would bring her exactly what she wished for. Well, one day the king ordered a celebration to take place for 3 whole days. And all the beautiful young women of that country were invited, so that the king's son could choose his future wife. Well, the 2 stepsisters heard about the celebration, and of course they were invited to attend. They were very pleased and called Cinderella and said, "Comb our hair, brush our shoes, and fasten our buckles. We're going to the wedding celebration at the king's castle." When Cinderella heard this, she couldn't help but cry, because she also really wanted to go to the ball, and she begged her stepmother to let her go. "You, Cinderella," she said, "covered in dust and dirt, and you want to attend the festival? You don't have a dress nor shoes. You want to dance, but how?" But Cinderella kept insisting. Finally, the stepmother said, "I have scattered a plate full of lentils in the ashes. If you can pick them up again in 2 hours, you can go with us." Then the maiden went to the back door that led to the garden and shouted. And she shouted for the doves there to help her pick up all the lentils so she would have time to go to the festival. Several doves flew through the kitchen window and assisted Cinderella with her chores, and not even an hour had passed and they had already finished everything. The girl took the bowl to her stepmother and was very happy that she would have time to go to the festival. She thought she was going to the festival, But the stepmother said, "No, Cinderella, you have no clothes and you don't know how to dance. Everyone will just laugh at you." Cinderella then started to cry, and then the stepmother said, "You can come with us if you can pick 2 bowls of lentils out of the ashes for me in 1 hour." And she thought, of course, that Cinderella would never be able to do that. The girl then went into the garden through the back doors and asked the doves for help again. Several doves came in through the kitchen window and helped Cinderella again, and in less than half an hour, they were already finished. The girl brought the bowls to her stepmother, who was once again very happy and pleased. But the stepmother said it was useless, as Cinderella lacked the proper clothes and dancing skills, and they would be ashamed of her presence. With that, she turned her back on Cinderella and ran off with her 2 proud daughters. Now there was no one else at home. Cinderella went to her mother's grave under the hazel tree and cried out, "Shake and tremble, little tree, throw gold and silver down to me." Then a bird threw down to Cinderella a dress of gold and silver and slippers embroidered with a silver C. She quickly donned the dress and attended the festival, unrecognized by her stepsisters and stepmother. They thought she must be a foreign princess, for she was so beautiful in the golden dress that she was unrecognizable. They never thought it was Cinderella, for they believed she was sitting at home on the floor picking lentils out of the ashes. In the middle of the party, the prince approached Cinderella, took her by the hand, and danced with her. Besides, he didn't dance with anyone else, only with her. He never let go of Cinderella's hand. And whenever someone came and invited her to dance, he would say, "She's my dance partner." He danced until night and then wanted to go home. But the prince said, "I will accompany you," because he wanted to see where the beautiful young woman belonged. But it didn't take long and Cinderella ended up disappearing from there. The prince waited until Cinderella's father arrived, then told him that she had disappeared. Then the old man thought, could it be Cinderella? He asked them to bring an axe and a pickaxe so he could break open the path where the princess had disappeared. But there was no one inside. When they got home, Cinderella was lying in the ashes, dressed in her dirty clothes. Beside her, the fireplace fire was fading. During her escape, Cinderella quickly jumped to the back of a dovecote and ran to the willow tree. She took off all her beautiful clothes and placed them on the grave. And the bird took them away again, and then, dressed in her gray apron, she went back home. The next day, when the party started again, and her parents and stepsisters had already left, Cinderella went to the hazel tree and said, "Shake and tremble, little tree, throw gold and silver down to me." Then the bird threw down, once again, a magnificent dress for Cinderella. And when she appeared at the festival in that dress, everyone was amazed by her beauty. The prince waited until she arrived, then immediately took her by the hand and danced only with her again. At nightfall, she wanted to leave, but the prince followed her, wanting to see where her house was. But she ran away from him and went to the garden behind the house. There was a beautiful tall tree there, from which magnificent pears were hanging. She climbed up the branches with the agility of a squirrel, and the prince didn't know where she had gone. The prince waited again for his father to arrive and said that the girl had disappeared. She had climbed up a pear tree. The father again thought it could be Cinderella, so he brought the axe and cut down the tree, but no one was there. When they arrived at the kitchen, Cinderella was lying in the ashes again. She had jumped from the pear tree to another tree and taken her beautiful dress back to the chest and put on the gray dress. On the 3rd day, after her family had left, Cinderella revisited her mother's grave and spoke to the tree. "Shake and tremble, little tree, throw gold and silver down to me." This time, the dove threw down for her a dress even more splendid and magnificent than any she had ever had before. The slippers were made of pure gold. When she arrived at the festival in that dress, everyone was extremely surprised and didn't know what to say. The prince danced only with her, and whenever someone tried to approach her, he would say that she was his dance partner. When he came down, Cinderella wanted to leave, and the prince tried to go with her, but she ran away from him so quickly that he couldn't follow her. The prince, however, set a trap. He ordered the entire staircase to be smeared with pitch. When she ran down the stairs, her left slipper got stuck on the floor. The prince picked up the small, delicate, pure gold shoe. The next morning, he went to the man and said, "No one will be my wife except the one whose foot fits this golden shoe." The 2 sisters were happy to hear this because they had beautiful feet. With her mother nearby, the eldest took the shoe to the room to try it on. She couldn't get her big toe into it because the shoe was too small for her. Then her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut off your toe? When you are queen, you won't have to walk anymore." The mother then cut off her toe and forced her foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went to the prince. He took her on his horse like a bride and left with her, but they had to pass by the grave. And there on the willow tree 2 doves were sitting, who told the prince that she was not the right bride, that the shoe was too tight, there was blood in the shoe. Tony looked at her foot and saw that there was indeed blood coming from it. He turned the horse around and took the false bride back home again, saying that she was not the right one and that the other sister should try on the shoe. This new sister went to the room and squeezed her toes and feet into the shoe, but the heel was too big. Her mother handed her a knife, telling her to slice off part of her heel, saying she wouldn't need to walk once she became queen. The girl cut off a piece of her heel, forced her foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went to the prince. And again he took her, thinking she was really his true bride. However, again the doves gave everything away, and he looked at the maiden's foot beside him and saw that there was blood running down. And since her shoe was stained red and her white stocking, he was sure she was not his true bride. So he turned around and went home again. The prince asked the man if there was not another daughter in the house, and he said no, there was only Cinderella deformed from his first wife, but she couldn't be the bride. The prince then told him to bring the maiden to him and for her to try on the shoe. But the stepmother replied no, she was too dirty, she couldn't be seen. But the prince persistently insisted, and they had to summon Cinderella. After washing her hands and face, she bowed before the prince, who gave her a golden shoe. She sat on a stool, took her heavy foot out of the wooden shoe, and put on the slipper, which fit her perfectly. When she stood up, the prince looked at her face and recognized her from his balls. She was the beautiful girl who had disguised herself with him. The stepmother and the 2 sisters were horrified and turned pale with anger. The prince put Cinderella on his horse and rode away with her. As they passed by the hazel tree this time, the doves cried out, confirming that she was indeed the bride. After they cried out, the 2 doves flew and landed on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right and the other on the left, and stayed there sitting. When her wedding with the prince was to take place, the 2 false sisters decided to show up and wanted to gain Cinderella's favor and share in her good fortune. When the bride and groom entered the church, the older sister walked on the right side and the younger on the left side. The doves pecked out both eyes of each of them. After leaving the church, the older sister was on the left side and the younger on the right, and the doves pecked out all their eyes again. And so, for their wickedness and deceit, both were punished with blindness for the rest of their lives. In a village, there once lived a country girl who was the most beautiful creature. Her mother adored her, and her grandmother loved her even more. This good woman had a little red hood made for her. It suited the girl so well that everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day, her mother, after making some cakes, said to her, "Go, my dear, and see how your grandmother is doing, because I heard she's very sick. Take her a cake and this little pot of butter." Little Red Riding Hood set out immediately to go to her grandmother, who lived in another village. While she was crossing the forest, she met a wolf who really wanted to eat her, but he didn't try to do it, right there because there were woodcutters nearby. Instead, he asked her where she was going, and the poor child, who didn't know it was dangerous to talk to the wolf, said to him, "I'm going to see my grandmother and take her this cake and this little pot of butter because my mother asked me to. Does she live far away?" The wolf asked where Little Red Riding Hood was going. She replied that it was beyond the mill in the first house of the village. Said the wolf, "I'll come see her too. I'll go one way and you go the other. Let's see who gets there first." The wolf ran as fast as he could, taking the shortest path, and the girl took a detour, entertaining herself with nuts, chasing butterflies, and picking bouquets of little flowers. It didn't take long for the wolf to reach the old lady's house and knock on the door. "Who's there?" asked the old lady. "It's your granddaughter, Little Red Riding Hood," the wolf replied, disguising his voice. The good grandmother, who was in bed due to illness, shouted that someone brought a cake and butter sent by your daughter. "Pull the bobbin, the latch will rise." The wolf pulled the bobbin and the door opened, and he immediately fell upon the good woman and ate her in a moment. for it had been more than 3 days since he had eaten. He then shut the door and waited in the grandmother's bed for Little Red Riding Hood, who arrived later and knocked. "Who's there?" the wolf asked in a deep voice. Little Red Riding Hood heard him. At first she was a little scared, but she believed that her grandmother had a cold and was hoarse, so she answered, "It's your granddaughter, Little Red Riding Hood, who brought you a cake and a little pot of butter that my mother sent me with." The wolf shouted to her, softening his voice as much as he could, "Pull the bobbin, the latch will go up." Little Red Riding Hood pulled the bobbin and the door opened. The wolf, who was hiding under the sheets, said, "Put the cake and the little pot of butter on the bench and come to bed with me." Little Red Riding Hood took off her clothes and went to bed. She was very surprised that her grandmother was wearing a nightgown and said to her, "Grandma, what big arms you have. It's to hug you better, my dear. Grandma, what big legs you have. It's to run better, my child. Grandma, what big ears you have. It's to hear better, my child. Grandma, what big eyes you have. Everything is better to see, my child. Grandma, what big teeth you have. To eat you better, my child." And saying these words, the evil wolf jumped on Little Red Riding Hood, ate her, and went away. If you watched this far, please like, subscribe, and hype up the channel if you can. See you next time. Thanks. See you. Bye.